We're going to finish up the 5th chapter of Shabbat, which is all about what animals can go out with and what they can't go out with. And as we've learned, the animals have to rest on Shabbat just as much as we do, and they can't work for us. And then as we go into the 6th chapter, we're going to start looking at what humans can go out with on Shabbat. But as we go over the boundary between the 5th and the 6th chapter, the Gemara is the Gemara is going to make a little excursus about personal responsibility, which we'll spend a minute talking about. And it's important just to cast our minds back and remember that most of these objects which are mentioned as not being permissible to go out with on Shabbat, whether it's, whether they're worn by a human or whether they're worn by an animal, most of them are not strictly prohibited according to the laws of Shabbat. But the rabbis are afraid that we will get into a position where we will really break Shabbat if something happens, or that will give the impression that we're breaking Shabbat. And so this chapter goes on. Ein chamor yotzei b'mardat bizman she'eina kshura lo. A donkey may not go out with a saddlecloth when it's not tied to it. That's tied to it before Shabbat. And we learned actually the reverse of this Mishnah yesterday, that it may go out when it is tied before Shabbat. But let's carry on. Or with a bell, even when it's plugged, because that seems like we're taking it to market. Or with a ladder around its neck. This ladder seems to be some kind of big yoke that they used to put on a donkey. Or with a strap around its foot. And the strap is clearly not for the benefit of the donkey. And it doesn't. We discussed yesterday the fact that animals can carry stuff that is important to them, but not stuff that's important to us. Along the same lines, the fowls don't go out with ribbons or threads or straps on their legs. Rams don't go out with a wagon under their tails. This wagon seems to be a contraption that people put underneath a really fat tail of a ram to stop it dragging on the ground. Ewes may not go out with a nostril chip. What's this nostril chip? Again, there's a lot of discussion in the Gemara about what this nostril chip is. Ein haruchelim yotzot chanunot. Chanunot. It's some kind of, well, the Gemara discusses it. The best explanation I can bring you is that it's some kind of chip that you would put into the nostril of the ewe to make it sneeze and to make it sneeze out gunk. But again, you wouldn't want to have that going around on Shabbat. And a calf doesn't go out with a small yoke. A cow with the skin of a hedgehog. They used to put hedgehog skins are prickly, right? And they used to put hedgehog skins on the feet of the cows to stop other animals attacking them, whether these are leeches or other kind of animals is not quite clear, but it's some kind of protection for the calf, or with a strap between its horns. And then the Mishnah concludes the chapter. This is the conclusion of the chapter on animals. Paratoshi Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah haytayotsa birtsua shebein karneha. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's cow used to go out with a strap between its horns. Just as we've learned, we can't do. We're not, the cow doesn't go out with a strap between its horns. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's cow used to do this. Shelo birtzon chachamim. And the chachamim did not agree. What's going on? Why do we bring this right at the end of the chapter? And we've talked before about the fact that very often the last words of a particular chapter are really important. And the Gemara comments, this is a famous Gemara, which everybody should learn. And I've only brought you just the first couple of lines here, but it goes on for probably a page or two. It's very, very interesting. And the Gemara says as follows: Lo shelo haita. That was not his cow. It was not his cow that used to go out with a strap between its horns. It wasn't his cow at all. Ela shel shchena, ela shel shchento haita. It was his neighbor's cow. Umitoch shelo michaba mikret al shmo. But because he did not protest, the Mishnah called it out in his name. And the Gemara then goes on to say, this is why it's a page or two, because it brings many, many examples of public figures who had the opportunity to stand up and to protest, to stand up and take a stand, who had influence over their communities, but who failed to do so. And the Gemara, it really reserves its most terrible criticism for community leaders who failed to speak up. And as we're going through these chapters that deal with keeping Shabbat, not necessarily with keeping the letter of Shabbat, but keeping far away from transgressing the prohibitions of Shabbat, it's interesting that the Gemara seems to go back here to discussing the role of community leaders in setting standards. So that's the end of chapter 5. And chapter 6 begins. Well, we remember the beginning of chapter 5. It reminds us of Bameh Madlikin, Bameh Behema Yotza, Uvameh Eina Yotza. And somewhat sadly, chapter 6 begins. Bameh Isha Yotza, Uvameh Eina Yotza. With what may a woman go out and with what may she not go out? There's a whole list of things that a woman shouldn't go out with. I don't know whether there's a woman in the Beit Midrash, by the way, when this was discussed. So we're reading this chapter of Mishnah, today, and we read it really with new eyes. There's a whole list of things. Not with woolen threads or linen threads or straps around her head. And then, just as we learned with the chains around the animal, she can't immerse herself. She can't immerse while wearing them unless she loosens them. So the Mishnah seems to be saying that it is possible to immerse while wearing these things, providing that they're loosened. And by the way, the Gemara says about the chains on the animal, where we said, you can sprinkle and you can immerse without taking them off the animals. The Gemara does say there, by the way, you need to loosen them a little bit to let the water get between the chain and the animal. And it seems to be saying the same thing here. Velo b'totefet, velo b'sanbutin. A totefet and a sanbutim seem to be some kind of frontlets or headdresses. And I've brought you a picture here from Steinsaltz. Steinsaltz has drawn this as he thinks they would have appeared in the time of the Gemara. So this is not an archaeological drawing. It's a drawing that is made and it appears in the Steinsaltz commentary. But I thought it'd be interesting for you just to see this. It's the totefet is some kind of decoration that goes around the forehead. Maybe it's related to the word for the head tefillin, which are totafot. And the headdress goes around the back of the head. And the Mishnah is going to say, not with a frontless or with a headdress if they're not sewn. That means sewn in together, sewn onto her hat. And not with a hairnet in the public domain, or a gold crown, or a necklace, or a ring without a seal. I mean, a ring with a seal is clearly an instrument of, it's clearly not decoration, right? With a seal is clearly a tool, or with an unpierced needle. And again, clearly, if the needle is pierced, it's clearly a tool. And we will learn about these later on in the chapter. But if it doesn't have a seal and it doesn't have an unpierced needle, it seems to be in a different category. And this chapter this Mishnah concludes with the words, Ve'im yatzat eina chayevet chatat. If she goes out with these, she's not liable to a sin offering, i.e., that these aren't really breaking Shabbat. Going out with these things is not really breaking Shabbat because they might be considered decoration. But the sages seem to be anxious that if you go out with something really pretty, the Mishnah seems to be anxious that you might take it off and show someone. And someone might end up carrying it for 4 amot in the public space, which certainly would be forbidden, when it's not being worn. So the Mishnah is not suggesting that wearing these is a prohibition, wearing these outside on Shabbat is a prohibition in itself. But it seems to be suggesting, just as we've seen in the early chapters of the Mishnah on Shabbat, it seems to be saying, look, we don't want to go out with these things in case we get into a situation where we carry them 4 amot in a public space, which really is a transgression of Shabbat. And the next Mishnah, which deals with what men can go out with, goes on exactly the same lines. Lo yitzeh ish b'sandal hamusumar, with nail-studded sandals. This seems to be a public health issue, as a matter of fact. If there's a crush, people can hurt themselves people can get hurt if they tread on each other with nail-studded sandals. So there seems to be a public health issue here. Nor with a single one if he's got no wound on his foot. Obviously, if his foot is wounded, either he wears a sandal on the wounded foot to protect it, or he doesn't wear a sandal on the wounded foot because he can't. But otherwise, we're not going to go out with one sandal. We might be tempted to take it off and carry it for 4 amot in the public domain. Nor with tefillin. Interesting as to whether perhaps in those times they wore tefillin on Shabbat. Nor with an amulet, nor with a coat of mail, nor with a helmet, nor with iron boots. These are all more like symbols, actually. But the Mishnah concludes in exactly the same way. Ve'im yatsa eino chayav chatat. If he did go out with these, he's not liable to a sin offering. Because carrying these things on Shabbat is not really breaking Shabbat. We are anxious that if he did go out with these things, he will get into a situation where he might carry them for 4 amot in public. But as we've done right the way through from the beginning of the Masechet, we're articulating practices that we take on just in order to keep us far away from possibly breaking Shabbat. And then as the chapter develops, we'll get into other issues which really are forbidden on Shabbat. And that will be the subject of the next Mishnah, which we'll pick up next week.